Okay, hi. Today we're going to talk about Plato's Book Seven. It's a very well-known book of the Republic because Book Seven starts with the analogy of the cave. Of course, we're going to talk about the analogy of the cave today. It's one of the most famous passages of Plato and probably in all of philosophy. And we'll talk about some other things that it talks about that he discusses in Book Seven as well. Not going to stay very long today. I think I have about 6 or 7 slides to go through. And I want to, again, as always, give some basic introductory guidance to people who are here in good faith, just sort of wanting to know what it's all about. But also, as always, I'm also mindful that I want to get on to some other ideas, maybe ones that you don't always hear when first talking about Plato's Book Seven. So, all right, let's get on with that. It's going to be, okay, there it is. Let me get that. Okay, Plato's Republic, Book 7. Let me get that. Here we go. Oopsie. Sorry. All right. As always, a little clunky there. Republic 6, Beyond the Cave. Beyond the cave, and what is the cave? You know, the cave is a step on a very fluid kind of journey, and you know, is it an analogy? Yeah, it's an analogy, but it's an analogy, I think, for a lot of sort of stages of life. So 2 points on this first slide that I have for you about it. I'm going to show you the cave in a second. I do have an illustration of the cave here, so if you really don't know what the setup is, just hang on for a sec. You know, the basic thing you already know, even if you haven't, you know, taken classes or anything like that with Plato, you probably, if you're here listening to this, you probably already know that these people are in a cave. They don't realize that they're in a cave. That is, they don't realize there's a world beyond what they can see. And then and there's a discussion of what it's like for them in that condition. And then there's a discussion of taking these people up into the light. And there are various details, but again, that's the basic structure that I'm pretty sure you probably already know. Now, the last 2 bullet points here then are 2 things that are really basic that we're not going to be able to get a super great interpretation of what's going on with Plato if we don't understand these. First, the metaphysical idea is that matter is coming to be and passing away into intelligible forms, into forms and states of things. When he says intelligible, he means we can identify it as a member of a category. Again, it might be a kind of animal, it might be a kind of piece of furniture, it might be just anything, a round thing, something with a geometric shape, anything that can be identified as a member of a category. That's what he means by an intelligible thing. And these forms are the form. That a form is this sort of ambient force that's giving the universe a kind of mathematical and formal structure. It's not itself located in space and time, except in as much as it's manifest in the physical world. This is so still on that second to last bullet point there. This is cosmological. This is metaphysical. Plato's not a modern philosopher. He didn't get the memo. He doesn't know that, according to Kant, you're looking at the way that the mind structures the input of its senses, and therefore you're not able to make any statements about real metaphysics. Plato doesn't know that. I'm with Plato on that. But in any event, if we want to understand what Plato's talking about, for better or for worse, we have to understand that his is a cosmological thesis. He's addressing the form matter structure of the whole universe and everything in the universe. Okay, and he doesn't know about the mind body problem the way that modern people like Descartes and Kant appreciate that. Probably doesn't know what that is. You'd have to do some work to explain that to him. Last bullet point, he's not a Cartesian. He doesn't have some sort of soul that's sort of sitting there kind of looking out through the eyes and changing as the body goes through everything that it does. This can be very confusing, I think, because Plato does talk here and any other number of other places, notably the Phaedo, but other places as well, about the immortality of the soul. So he thinks there's something that is the soul, and he does think that it's immortal. So certainly then ordinarily, or by our understanding of conventions, we would think that meant that he thinks that you have a soul, I have a soul, these souls are sort of unchanging and adamantine as our bodies go through our lives. But that's not really the idea here. Again, he doesn't have this mind-body distinction, especially. And he thinks that you come to be as a person and you fall away as a person. Remember, Plato thinks there are degrees of being. That's that last bullet point again. You can be more or less of a person, something that doesn't sit comfortably, again, with our sort of Cartesian intuitions about things. So coming up out of the cave is actually coming into a different kind of being. And we'll talk a little bit more too about how that also puts a little bit more of an edge on the resistance of the denizens of the cave to change. So again, he's making cosmological statements. He really means it for real, of the kind that many modern philosophers think with their sort of psychologizing overall picture can't be done. That is a real block to understanding Plato, in my experience, for a lot of people. So I warn you off of that. He's not a Cartesian, and he never read Kant. He doesn't think that everything's a projection of the mind, notably not geometry and those kinds of formal structures, logic. He thinks those are real things that are in the world. And second point, he's not a mind-body dualist. So he's talking about the coming to be and passing away of persons, which to him includes both what we would call mind and body. All right, so here's the cave. You have the people, they are bound. They can only look at a wall that's in front of them. That little roadway, there are people who have made signs which are copies of artifacts. And of course, the shadows that those signs, like a sign which is maybe a cardboard cutout of a table, right? So it's a copy of a table, and someone's walking on that roadway with that, maybe on a stick, and then the shadow of that is being cast onto the wall in front of those prisoners. So they're looking at a shadow of a simulacrum of an artifact or something like that, and that's of course all the idea, farther and farther away from reality, which at this point is a familiar trope if we're reading Plato and reading the Republic. And then there is a way up to the sun. They can go up into the realm and see the world as it's lit up by the sun. And furthermore, there is also a person who comes down from above and drags one of them kicking and screaming up to the top. They don't want to go. Once they get up there, it takes them quite a while to get used to the light. And when they come down, they've changed. And the other people who've been down in the cave don't like them anymore. And they think that they're out of touch with reality, because of course the people in the cave think that they're the ones that are in touch with reality. So they think someone coming with a story about some higher realm of being is just telling them something crazy. And also notice, and this is important, there are people moving upward and people moving downward. This is a tidal, cyclical picture of coming into being and passing away out of being. Who are the prisoners? Plato stresses that a lot of it is social conformity. He says, you've got these teachings of these sophists and these other various sort of flim-flams and mistaken ideas. But the real problem is all the people out at military camps or at the festivals, or just hang out with everybody else, and all the stories and all the stuff that they get exposed to. The social construction of reality is something that Plato's very wary about, since, of course, he's a moral realist, and so he doesn't buy it that things like credos and mores and cultures are merely social constructions. This time around, I do this a lot, but this course, I'm really noticing how much I think we underestimate what a sort of social radical he is. He starts off by saying he's against materialism. It's when the original city slides into materialism that starts to have a problem, and that's why it needs this rational revolution. It looks a lot like a Marxist revolution. I'm not saying that pro or con, just to describe what it is that we're looking at. And then at a deeper level, this is a universal literary trope. It's the human condition. We're always in this condition. We're always trying to bring ourselves up into light. He has a technical point that we're trying to bring ourselves up into a greater degree of rational awareness. So who are these people? I think they're generic, unenlightened people. I was talking about that when we were talking about some of the early books, particularly, for example, in book 5. These people are polyphy. They're not meant to be fully formed people. They're examples. So this is sort of a generic unenlightened person who's in this state. And, and notice also these can be steps and steps. This could be an endless series of steps like this, an endless series of steps that could go up or that could go down. And this is, we can look at the description that way as well. There's a really, I think, very trenchant critique of empiricism early on in book 7. And I think it's important. I mean, as a philosopher, I'm really someone with a lot of empiricist sympathies, and particularly a lot of empiricist approaches, like nominalist approaches to metaphysical problems, are, as I say, ones that I'm sympathetic with. I'm not a Plato groupie or anything like that. And as I say, in terms of psychology, I'm sort of more in the empiricist tradition of things, I would say, than the rationalist one, although, of course, I'm interested in both. But this critique of empiricism that we find at the beginning of book 7 in the Republic really is remarkable. And one of the things that's remarkable is how much it anticipates David Hume's description of knowledge production through inductive inference. He really gets it. He says, Plato does. And he says, these people who think that, the only reality are just these shadows on the wall, then they're going to produce knowledge the only way they can. That is by developing expectations through regularities of repetitions of these images. And if there were prizes for who best remembered, which usually came earlier, which later, and which simultaneously, remember classical conditioning, and who could thus best divine the future, habituations, expectations about future regularities based on regularities of past experience. Do you think our man would desire those rewards? Well, no. Because last bullet point, since their experience is composed wholly of shadows, they can only make inductive inferences from shadow regularity. The reason why these regularities exist is not a question they can answer. They just don't ask that question, but you could ask that question. And that is a good critique of empiricism. And I would say it's when I think about the metaphysics of mathematics that I get whatever Platonic intuitions I have. I don't think that empiricism does a great job on explaining mathematics. Another big sort of story here, again, what's really going on with Plato? You get this new natural science coming out of Ionia, and it is very much a physical materialist science, really fully formed out of the womb. Another remarkable thing. I mean, these are physicists who are describing a kind of value neutral world of cause and effect. And in that world, the same thing can be both hot or cold. The same thing can be both big or small. Perspectivalism obtains. It's a paradoxical world. And since this is this new physical picture of the world, remember, Kant was reacting against Hume's new empiricist picture of the world. He didn't like the look of that either. And Plato doesn't like the Ionian picture of things for really the same kinds of reasons. It looks like a sort of godless, amoral, violent, meaningless world. And Plato thinks, he just doesn't believe it. He thinks that's like false. He's not trying to cook something up to make his program go through. He's real sure that that's an incorrect description of what reality is like. But in any event, the story here is that the sophists, like Protagoras, who says that man is the measure of all things. Remember, Heraclitus also said, guard your laws as you would your city wall. That was one of his fragments. The idea is then that human conventions, human political and social conventions, are these kind of bulwarks against this harsh, cold, senseless reality. And so then, the picture is that all the human political and social structures are social constructions because the humans build them themselves. And from that, of course, you also get a sort of more general relativism. Thrasymachus in book 1 is the representative of the sophistic tradition. Thrasymachus doesn't think he's a bully. He doesn't think of himself as being harsh. He thinks he's being misunderstood. He just believes it's a matter of fact that power relationships are really the only thing that introduce stability into the world. You'll notice he buys the Ionian physicalist story that is clashing flows of power. He buys it, and he says, and so when he says, "Well, humans have to construct a social polis," he sees that as another sort of manifestation of power, as does then Protagoras. Protagoras is the real target. And Plato mentions Protagoras more than any other philosopher in his writings, by the way. So yeah, third bullet point, the view that all political and social relationships are essentially relationships of power. This is a widespread view today. You'll often hear this kind of view expressed or implied. Besides its reductive nature, I would just point out, and just me talking, that the idea that human relationships are all about power is just enormously reductive and kind of barren. And I don't think about myself for a moment. But in any event, it's a discussion, it's a philosophical discussion we can have. Besides the to me, plainly really reductive nature of this kind of attitude towards human relationships as power relationships. It's really a kind of formalization of violence itself. That is, it kind of does codify the situation. Well, since it's just a world of senseless clashes of power, then we as human beings are just going to have to set something up, and someone's going to have to be in charge. And that has, again, the sort of opposite effect as the one that it should have, because Plato sees that long term that's incorrect, and there is not a social construction. What you do want is to somehow be based on some kind of real moral truth, objective truth. Again, this is Plato talking, this is the way he thinks about things, moral realist. So it's actually a disaster to fail to realize that, and to think that your social and political arrangements are merely power structures. And then last bullet point, specifically, the rational revolutionary is literally an existential threat to the existing status quo. Look, the way Protagoras sees things, he's, being in favor of the status quo is just something really important, because if not for the status quo, then it's just the chaos without. So, so this whole sophistical approach to the sort of social construction of power seems very sort of self-justifying, as well as other things. Socrates, not so much maybe Plato, but Socrates, and there is a distinction between the two of them. He really, granting that there's the Socrates that's a character in Plato, he really does want to do some revolution. He really is a sort of street revolutionary. Plato is suggesting very revolutionary things from the point of view of noble Greek-speaking property-owning men. Is he doing that to shock? Probably to some extent, and definitely to make the point that they're not living a fully rationalized life, certainly. Last thing I say on this slide is this goes to the execution of Socrates, right? Notice Socrates, Plato and Socrates, they are together on this, are saying, no, look, it's not political power, social power and status are not just some sort of arbitrary social constructions. They're real. And furthermore, when you say that they are, you're really just committing us ultimately, it's got to end up in some kind of violence, since you're the ones who say that power is what defines the success or failure of a relationship. And sure enough, Socrates couldn't live. Interesting point about military mathematics. I mentioned it here again. I was trying to come up with maybe some points that have eluded, really standard introductions. You say, well, he's a mystic. He wants everyone to sort of meditate on these kind of transcendental kind of baubles of mathematics. But here in this passage, he explains why it is that the future philosopher king needs to spend time as a guardian, needs to spend time in the military. And he thinks that that's very important. But here he explains an interesting reason why he thinks that's important, because he thinks that it's precisely if you haven't been spending your life involved in matters of life and death and activities of life and death, then you're the one who's not going to understand the importance of rationality and rational truth, such as how many soldiers do we have, how many soldiers do they have, how long is it going to take to march there, and so on. In fact, he says here, it's in combat where life and death depend on mathematical precision, that kind of mathematical precision. How long, how much time, how many. And that's then, he thinks, where people actually learn the value of mathematics, right? And why it's something that needs to be understood. Military experience is essential training for rationalists, stealing them with the experience of the facticity of life, and so against relativism. Again, how far, how many, that's, you can't make that up. That's not just what you want it to be or what you say it is. That's not a projection. That's what's going to kill you or not, depending on whether you understand what those numbers mean and deal with them correctly. Combat, this last bullet point, is the final test or proof of the centrality of applied mathematics to life. That's where you really learn how important it really is. What are you learning? Is there realism, right? Both epistemological realism and moral realism. After this test, the adept is ready to go on to the study of higher, non-instrumental mathematical truths. So military experience is like the final exam in applied mathematics. I mean, literally, that's what he means. And that might sound warlike too. Again, Plato's always getting criticized for this or that. I'm not an apologist for him. But he is very concerned about the degree of violence that exists in his society. All of the people in the Republic have experienced combat, and quite a few of the characters in the Republic are murdered later on. Polymarchus, the wealthy young man, Cephalus' son, he's killed at 404 in real life. Of course, all the characters in Plato's dialogues are real historical figures. Last, then, couple things I'll say, last two slides I think we have here. I want to get at, among other things, I want to get at these axial age commonalities between Hindu and Buddhist teaching and Greek teaching, notably Plato's teaching. We also could mention the Taoist and Confucian teachings at the same time. What time is this? We're talking about maybe 7th to 4th century, the middle of the first millennium BCE, about 2,500 years ago, about 500 years before what we would call the time of Christ or Roman times. And that's called the axial age. And it is just the case that we can see common threads in the basic teachings that we find from the different traditions in that age, all pretty basic about the control of the mind over the irrational passions of the body. That's a Platonic way of putting it. But one thing that we see here is there's that person who comes down and gets all the people and tries to bring the people out of the cave up to the light. They don't want to go. They're struggling and fighting. Who is this person? Christ came back, rose from the dead to share his teachings with humankind. The Buddha in Mahayana Buddhist teaching comes back to the realm of being of samsara, of craving and satisfaction, to work towards the ultimate end of suffering of all sentient beings. In all cases, in all of these examples, you see that the spiritual character is selfless. And in giving up oneself, then, this is a big part of this notion of return, that you have liberated yourself from yourself and now can return to do really good works in the world. And we see that both in the analogy in the cave and in the Mahayana doctrine of Buddha's return. Having seen the light of reason, this is the second bullet point, the enlightened person understands that all things and all persons are one. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Socrates refers to the sense of liberation through selflessness. Remember, he already said this to Glaucon once before, when Glaucon was questioning why would anyone want to be one of these guardians? They live this communistic, propertyless life. Doesn't look like it's going to be much fun for them. And Socrates said that, well, it's not about the happiness of the individual. It's about the happiness of the collective, the well-being of the collective. Now, that could just sound like a kind of sort of totalitarian kind of thing to say, and maybe it is. But let's make a connection here that, the individual considered as an individual, a member of the many, which is not part of the unified collective. The collective is the one. So, right. So that doctrine of selflessness, that liberation is really not you coming into some wonderful state, but rather the dissolution of you altogether. And, that's the end of your suffering. And that's really what the teaching is. It's only the body that belongs to multiplicity. It's only the tyrant The political activity of the body can only be the activity of the tyrant or the democrat, because it's just passion-based. Last bullet point. The enlightened one has lost all sense of ego, selfhood, and still returns to material life to work for the benefit of all suffering beings. And again, we see that same kind of sense in the analogy of the cave. I also think of the cave as a woman birth canal too. I mean, I'm not going to unpack that. I do that in class though, and it looks like it. Finally, then, and this is basic axial age teaching. So let me just go through this slide and then I'll be done. And this is my take on good things to know about Plato's book 7, maybe before you read it or when you're thinking about it. The taijutsu is that yin yang symbol, the little circle with the two sides. It has cosmological significance. The idea is you had sort of primal beings. Sometimes that's even described as nothingness. In the Asian tradition, oneness is often nothingness as opposed to an individual something. And again, Plato, the Greeks, and to some extent the Zoroastrians are taking mathematics, which interestingly has all these properties, indivisible, eternal, and changing, right, for what they take to be the way to express oneness. But in the taijutsu anyway, there's a sort of fissure, a line forms across emptiness, and it starts spinning. And all the individual things, all the furniture of the universe comes spinning out of the one. The many come from the one. The Eleatics, and Plato's in this tradition, the tradition of Pythagoras and Parmenides. Plato very self-consciously in this tradition, doing exactly at his academy what we understand people did when they were with Pythagoras in his temple, which is do geometry proofs and logic proofs in order to contemplate universals in themselves and not as they related to individual things. And Pythagoras, we don't know that much about the real Pythagoras, but here's the idea. The universe is made of numbers, and numbers, not physical atoms, like later on Democritus would say, maybe they're little physical atoms, little beanies or something. But no, the idea here is that the fundamental being is mathematical. And so numbers are the points. What are these points? Like, is it a set 1 through 13? No, well, yeah, but when I say the integer, right? Think about this number, then they're all little ones. It's a little set of little ones, okay? You can count them if you want. But the integer is just a number, the concept of a number. Notice if we were looking at that grammatically, like Wittgenstein, we might wonder about that. You say that you have this way of talking and now you think that there are all these little numbers. And that's okay. We don't have to worry about how that inquiry comes out, by the way, because the notion here is that the atomic concept is the integer, not a physical particle, but some kind of mathematical particle, a little number 1. Third bullet point. This is deep. I assure you that it's not cranky, and you can see the logic of it. We can talk about it a little bit. In the concept of the integer, just the notion that there's a number, that something has a number, that there's a number of things. The concept of number contains all of mathematics and logic. It contains the concept of 1, it contains the concept of 2, it contains the concept of 3, and they contain the concept of the functions of plus and addition and equality. So Plato's right in a sense that mathematics is this bridge between the one and the many. The integer is the concept, the original concept, both for the notion of the one, the unity, and for the notion of the many, the parts of the whole. They both fall out of the concept of the integer. So that's the place. That's the source. Again, you have the concept of a number. In the concept of a number is the concept of oneness, but also implicit in that concept is the concept of the many. Finally, and last bullet point there in book 9, the misery of the tyrant's caused by his own impulsive carnal nature, right? He's totally the slave to his own nature. Whereas the philosopher enjoys the tranquility of freedom from the body. That's the idea. That is selflessness, which is part of this axial age tradition, which we also can identify, for example, very closely with Indian philosophy like Hinduism and Buddhism. It's liberation, say one more time, liberation through selflessness, through the transcendence of the physical self, and the dissolution of the individual self, and an appreciation of one's identity with the one, with the totality of everything. That's really the teaching. So, all right. So that's just another little introduction to Book 7 of the Republic. Again, I for one, perfectly happy to look at multiple introductions to Republic Book 7 or any of the books of the Republic or anything else, because that's just how it goes. And you have more stuff to look at. Hopefully I raised today maybe a couple issues that are, not quite so much on the beaten path when people are talking about the analogy of the cave in Book 7 of the Republic. In any event, I'll leave that for you to judge. Thanks for your attention today. Bye-bye.